Hi, it's Nate Charles, and welcome back to the Rule of Law Brief. Tonight I want to talk about Greenland. Let's talk in detail about what's actually going on here. Let's start with some basic principles. Greenland actually does matter, far more than you might think just by looking at it on a map. If your instinct is to say that this is all about money or mineral wealth, you're not entirely wrong. Greenland does possess significant deposits of rare earth elements and other critical minerals, the kinds of resources that modern economies and even militaries depend on. Anyone pretending that that doesn't factor into this geopolitical mess is being unserious. But here's a reality check. About 80% of Greenland is covered in ice. Extracting those rare earth elements at scale would be extraordinarily difficult, enormously expensive, and in many cases just not feasible at all given current technology. This is by no means some sort of short-term mining bonanza. So if Greenland were only about mineral wealth, the level of political attention that it's getting these days simply wouldn't add up, which tells us that there is something more going on here. The real significance of Greenland lies in its geography and the rapidly evolving nature of international defense. The Arctic is warming faster than any other region on Earth. The ice caps are melting. Sea lanes that were once impassable are becoming navigable. Within the next couple of decades, the polar regions of the Earth will no longer function as natural barriers. They will increasingly become usable maritime corridors. This matters because for centuries, European powers searched unsuccessfully for the Northwest Passage, a shorter route between Europe and Asia. Climate change has now made that passage real. Greenland sits squarely in the middle of this emerging Arctic reality. Control of airspace, early warning systems, naval access, and undersea infrastructure in the Arctic will matter enormously in the coming decades. That is why Greenland is so geopolitically valuable. Now, there's no shortage of irony here. The Republican Party has spent years mobilizing its largely ignorant base by denigrating climate science and treating climate change as a cultural grievance rather than an empirical reality. But the actual power brokers within the Republican Party, particularly those involved in defense and national security, know perfectly well that climate change is real, it is human caused, and it is strategically consequential. They understand as much as anybody else that melting ice caps are transforming the Arctic from a natural barrier into a navigable domain with profound implications for global trade and military power. In that sense, climate change is not a peripheral issue in the Trump administration's interest in Greenland. It is the central driver. Public denial may be politically useful, but strategic planning within the Republican national security apparatus is already operating on the assumption that the Arctic is opening and that control over that space will matter. But as valuable as it is, Greenland is not a free-floating asset. Greenland is also a self-governing, semi-autonomous territory of the Kingdom of Denmark. Denmark controls foreign policy and defense, and Denmark is a NATO member state, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. That fact alone should define how the United States approaches Greenland, because of course, the United States is itself a member of NATO and one of its founding members. NATO is not just another treaty. It has been the backbone of the international security order since the end of World War II, nearly 80 years. At the heart of NATO is Article 5 of the NATO Charter, which states plainly that an attack on one member of NATO is an attack on all the members of NATO. That commitment is not symbolic. It is the core deterrent that has prevented large-scale war in Europe for generations. NATO was initially designed, at least in part, to prevent unchecked remilitarization after World War II. It quickly evolved into the primary counterweight to the Soviet-led Warsaw Pact during the Cold War. Through all that history, NATO functioned on one central premise: security through collective defense, not coercion among allies. Now, Donald Trump has repeatedly claimed that Denmark doesn't have a legitimate claim to Greenland because it supposedly cannot defend it adequately. Against the background that we just described, that assertion should set off alarm bells. That argument makes no sense if NATO Article 5 means anything. Denmark does not need to defend Greenland alone. An attack on Greenland would be an attack on Denmark, and an attack on Denmark would trigger Article 5, and every NATO member would be obligated to respond. So when Trump suggests that Denmark lacks legitimacy because it cannot protect Greenland, he is implicitly saying something far more consequential. NATO no longer matters. A few weeks ago, I argued publicly that any aggressive move by the United States to seize or invade Greenland would result in the immediate loss of American bases across Europe, and that such a move would be enormously foolish. I now think that analysis didn't go far enough. The situation is far worse than merely incompetence. It's not that Trump and his national security team don't understand these consequences. It's that their strategy assumes that international law does not matter at all. The bottom line here is Donald Trump is not stupid. He is malevolent. His worldview, both domestically and internationally, is rooted in the idea that might makes right. To paraphrase Thucydides, the through line of history is that the strong do what they will and the weak endure what they must. Donald Trump does not see that as a warning. He sees it as an instruction, and his worldview does not stop at international borders. The same contempt that Donald Trump shows for NATO, for international treaties generally, and for allied sovereignty is the same contempt that he shows for due process, constitutional limits, individual rights, and the very rule of law itself. He does not ask whether something is legal. He asks whether he can get away with it. That is the only check on his actions. If the courts can be ignored, they will be ignored. If treaties can be violated, they will be violated. If allies can be coerced, they will be coerced. Greenland is not an anomaly. It is a case study. Once again, this entire conversation is just another cluster of data points in a pattern with one overarching theme. Donald Trump's leadership is fundamentally inconsistent with American values. He does not believe in the rule of law. He believes in the rule of men, specifically his own rule, indefinitely. He does not believe that objective standards mean anything. He believes that as the most powerful person on the planet, he will do what he can, and that everyone else, including his own people, will suffer what they must. That worldview is not American. It is not constitutional, and it is not compatible with a rules-based international order. Greenland just makes that reality impossible to ignore.